Thank you for joining us for another Wednesdays in the Word, and we're going to go ahead and continue with our study about heaven and hell. We do have one more issue that relates to hell that I need to deal with today, and then we'll do a few sessions on heaven. But let me say by way of caveat before we jump into today's lessons that I really apologize that I couldn't share with you on last week. Last week was really, really tough. As some of you all may know, many of you all may not, I lost a very, very close and dear friend, Pastor Rodney Frazier, Dr. Frazier, who pastors Restoration Church in Cedar Hill, Texas. I left a couple of links in the description box so you can see his bio. But this incredible man of God, this gifted, visionary musician, pastor, has gone on to be with the Lord. Very sudden, definitely a shock. He was actually doing very well and just ran into something that really took him down in less than 24 hours. And so he's gone on to be with the Lord. And that was a little tough on me and just could not get the video out last week. And so I'm back, and I surely would appreciate your prayers for me, as he was a very close friend, again, like a brother, and then the Frazier family. And so appreciate your patience on this, y'all. And we're going to get back into this thing and really do some time together as we continue this issue. So in this video, we want to raise the question, who is really going to hell? Again, thank you for joining us. And before we jump into today's lesson, if you haven't had a chance, make sure you check out the last video that we posted entitled Final Judgment, because I want you to see this as more of an addendum or a footnote to that video. That's kind of how I'm presenting it, because I definitely believe everything that I shared there. I believe that reflects the biblical view. I admit at the forefront that, hey, I don't have everything together on this. I'm just as fallible as any Bible interpreter, and we need to say that as Christians. I think we can think that somehow our ideas are specifically or directly given to us by God himself, and that's just not the case. I definitely believe there's some issues that are definite and concrete, but the truth is we don't know it all. And so you'll see my ideas here, but consider this video as more of a footnote. Matter of fact, I would call it, if I could, a footnote on hell. And I'm raising that question, who really is going to hell? Because there are a couple of scriptures in which Jesus really goes in on the religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. And you'll see that over and over again if you look or read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, especially in the synoptics, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus is kind of the opponent. He's the antagonist to these groups of leaders who are responsible for not only the religious life of Israel, but in many respects, the political life. And I mean, he goes in on them. He calls them everything but a child of God. And I think the way the biblical writers are using that material is not just the condemnation of Israel's leadership, but as a subtle kind of subversive message to the leaders of the church. To those who are responsible for handling the word, such as myself, to pastors, to bishops, to those who give voice and direction and vision to Christianity, that listen, we can't fall into the same trap as the religious leadership did in Jesus's day, because they got under his skin very much so. And if they really cause angst for Jesus, what do you think about leaders who don't represent him well? So that's the idea. So let me just read a couple of scriptures for you. The passage that I'm really focusing in on is Matthew 23, which is one of the last sermons that Jesus will preach. It's called the Woe Sermon. It's 7 woes, and that word woe was a prophetic word, a word from the Old Testament in which the prophets would speak judgment or condemnation on the nation or surrounding nations, that is the nation of Israel, or other nations that had transgressed the law of God or how they treated people. But also too, that word had a sense of grief. And so it was judgment and condemnation on the one hand, it was grief and sorrow on the other. And you see that with Jesus. He just goes in on the religious leadership in Matthew 23. But at the end, he's like a prophet that weeps over the city that he knows is going to be destroyed. And that's exactly what happened. If history serves us correct, most place the death of Jesus at about AD 36, 35, somewhere in there. Well, Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. So as a prophet, his prediction came true as he wept over the city. And this sermon preceded it. So look at these verses. Matthew 23:15. Look what he says. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. And so here he calls them the children of hell. It's a scathing condemnation. And then verse 33 of the same chapter, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the fiery, how will you escape being condemned to hell? And so here Jesus categorically, unequivocally condemns the religious leadership as if they are individuals worthy of hell. And again, you got to see my last video about the final judgment. I definitely believe that Jesus, or the scriptures present that Jesus will be the final judge, and he will decide who will go to heaven, who will go to hell. And I believe those who trust Christ will be with him forever. I definitely believe that with all my heart. And those who have not trusted Christ, it's not that God is angry with them. They have simply chosen not to be in God's presence. And God says, I will grant you his wish. And I just believe anything outside of God's presence is a living hell. That heaven, God is the one that makes heaven, and he makes it a wonderful place. And so we would be in his presence forever. And so here Jesus condemns these individuals. And I think it's a subtle comment. I think it's a subtle footnote worth noting that many times we may take for granted, that as followers of Jesus, as people of faith, as leaders, we need to be careful. There's a warning. Jesus does not use double talk when it comes to his judgment. Whatever he expects for one group, he expects even more from his own people. And I definitely believe in the sufficiency of the cross to save. So please don't hit me with theological questions. I just think this is just a subtle warning. It's a footnote, if you will. It's a disclosure statement in our contract. Don't be so smug. Don't be like the Pharisees. Don't be like the Sadducees and the scribes, and to think that somehow Christ is okay with that. I think that is definitely the message that we need to be careful of. And I would even argue that some of the other uses of hell, that's exactly what he's after, particularly his Matthew 25 passage when he says, in verse 41, then he will say to those on his left, this is when he separates the sheep from the goat. Depart from me, you who are cursed, in the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And many times when scholars or commentators talk about this passage, they talk about the theology of hell, but rarely do they talk about why Jesus sends them to hell. And it's not because they believed certain doctrine or teaching about Jesus. It's because they didn't practice what Jesus wanted. They verbally said they were Christians, but they didn't visit the sick. They didn't visit those in prison. They didn't do the things that would reflect Christ. And so those are the ones who were sent to hell. So listen to what it says. He says, for I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison and you did not look after me. And they also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? He will reply, truly I say, to whatever you did not do for the one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away, there it is, to eternal punishment, but the righteous Not because of what they believed mentally, but because of how they practiced and shared righteousness into eternal life. And so many times I think we can preach the theology and the reality of hell, but we disconnect some of the behaviors and the practices that ought to concern Christians. And so that is a really strong issue. And here I would also add as an example the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And there we get a very vivid picture of hell. And as we stated in previous videos, some see that as literal because Lazarus is mentioned by name, and it's the only parable that Jesus uses in which he mentions one of the characters by name. So some have deduced that, hey, this is a real story. But then also, too, the other side would say, no, it's a parable like any other parable, which a parable is a made-up story to make a point. But I think both of the points miss that the whole reason why Jesus spoke the parable goes back to verse 14, chapter 16 of Luke, where he's talking about the Pharisees and their greed for money. That you can be a religious leader, you can be a person of faith, and you can be a person that has authority in the church, and it's all about the money and you forget the mission. And that's what angered Jesus. And so here, all I'm saying is, I think there's a subtle footnote, and not a footnote in the sense that God kind of reneges on our salvation contract. I definitely believe it's more of a warning, a strong and stern warning to all of us to make sure that we're careful about how we live, how we carry ourselves, particularly leaders, how we lead, and how we represent Christ in this world, that we should represent him most importantly by the life he lived and how we treat one another. And so what I want to do in this last portion of the video is just give you 4 practices or elements that we need to be aware of, that we don't fall into the trap as the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, the religious leadership, and even some of the broader faith practicing community fell into, that really rankled the nerves of Jesus. And so we want to be very careful. This is based on Matthew 23. And I want to encourage you, if you've never read the sermon, it's really worth a read, because I think there's this idea out there that Jesus just comes some kind of milquetoast, soft, spineless kind of individual. But boy, you read that, that's the sermon that got you killed. Matter of fact, I want to preach a sermon one day. I want to talk about the sermon that got Jesus killed. Are we preaching sermons like that? And this is the one in which they said, okay, we need to take this guy out. And that's the kind of preacher that I want to be, because I just think he was on point. So there are 4 issues or 4 elements that I think concern Jesus, that as followers of Jesus, we must be careful. The first one I'm calling an oppressive moralism. Oppressive moralism. And I'm purposely choosing the adjective oppressive here to modify moralism. And that's based on verse 4. They tie up heavy and cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. This oppressive moralism. And what I mean is it's a moralism that takes rules much further than God intended. You make the rule more important than the relationship with God. Should we have rules? Of course. We absolutely need rules, because they're boundaries, they're guardrails. They help us understand where God wants us to start or stop. That's what rules serve. They help us, they give us insight into where God's heart is if somehow we're confused as to where we stand. When Moses came off Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, those were rules, those were morals, those were standards. So the people of God would know, okay, here are the boundaries that I must stay within if I'm going to follow God. Jesus with the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. And so yes, we ought to have standards, we ought to have rules, because it gives us insight into the heart of God. The problem is when we make the rule more important than the relationship with God, that's where we run into trouble. And I think that's what Jesus was concerned when it came to the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees. They made the rule more important in such a way that they used the rule to be oppressive upon people. They made the rule so hard that following God became extremely difficult. But most importantly, they made the rule so difficult that it became a tool or a weapon of power. And the very tool that Jesus gave to us in which we're to follow him, men throughout history and women have used it as a tool and weaponized it to destroy people. So we got to be careful with that. We can't be hair splitting. We can't be nitpicking in such a way in which that we're the only ones that can live faith and then somehow forget that God extended amazing grace to us as he does for anybody else. And number two, which I think is vitally important here, a glaring hypocrisy. And if you know anything about Jesus, Jesus absolutely hated, he detested hypocrisy. And so here by hypocrisy, we mean setting a standard that is so lofty that not only others cannot fulfill the standard, but we ourselves fail to fulfill that standard. It's kind of like what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7. You know, we can see the speck in our brother and sister's eye, but we ignore or fail to see the log in our own eye. It's this double standard Christianity that we apply. And so we have a higher standard, a higher expectation and standard for others while having a lesser expectation for ourselves. And then wondering or forgetting that God extends the same grace to us as he does to others. And Jesus really rails on this. And here it's really the difference between transformation and performance or externals. Much of what the scribes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees lived with this external religion. It was all surface. They had the language right. They had the clothing right. They knew the scriptures to quote. They were part of a religious culture. But on the inside, nothing had changed because it was a culture of religious performance. And Jesus was not impressed by that. He's more impressed by transformation. And so we see this in verse 26 of chapter 3, blind Pharisee. First clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but there it is, but on the inside are full of the bones of dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. And there's an element of our Christianity that we always have to be careful. It's easy to put the mask. It's easy to put on the religious language. It's easy to turn up the spirituality without it affecting our hearts. And Jesus says we got to be intentional to ignore those mechanisms and allow God to focus on our heart. In a word, we should be growing every single day. And so you've heard me say this time and time again, particularly at Christ Community. God is not really after perfection because he knows in our hearts we cannot do it. One day we will be perfect, but it is a process. Ought to be growing to become more like Christ every single day. And so it's okay to be in the first grade spiritually. But now if I've been in the first grade spiritually for 10 years, something's wrong with that. Something's not right. At some point, I ought to go to the second grade, third, the fourth grade spiritually. God did not design my spiritual growth pattern to exist at one level for the totality of my life. There ought to be some progress. There ought to be some internal change. There ought to be some attitudinal change. And so issues of forgiveness, issues of repentance, accountability, issues of compassion, issues issues of anger, issues of bitterness, issues of living our lives in a way that is holy and honoring to God. It's not perfection today or overnight, but it is a process we should be willing to live. So again, Jesus is into transformation and not performance. And a lot of times we got to be careful, because the Achilles heel of Christianity is that we can put on the cloak, can't we? We can put on the robe of righteousness. We can wear the crown of Christianity and still live like the devil from our hearts. And so we've got to allow God to get close to transform and change our hearts. Number 3, a disregard of people, a disregard of people. And we see this in verse 23, where he tells them that, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters, or the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. He's definitely saying, look, we have responsibilities in the law, but the temptation of Christianity is to make greater importance of issues that we like and lesser importance of the issues that we don't like. And there has to be some kind of balance, particularly as it comes to people. And one of the things that really disturbed our master was how the religious leadership treated people. The issue of fellowship, the issue of sinners, the issue of Gentiles. And sinners not in the sense of we understand sinners theologically who've fallen short of the glory of God because of the natural fallenness of human sin. But individuals were deemed as sinners in that culture, and they were demonized and ostracized and marginalized, whether it was the tax collectors or whether it was Gentiles or whether it was widows. These were individuals, the poor. They were marginalized and deemed and labeled as sinners. And here, this is a word that Jesus really cared about people. And really, I want to say a word here, and you've heard me say this. It's not about how much you know that's going to bring you into God's presence. No, it's about how you treat people. Don't forget the words of Jesus in Matthew 25 when he separates the sheep from the goats. It's not because of what they knew. It's what they practiced that determined whether they would come into the kingdom or not. I'm not saying that's the basis, that it's a works-based salvation. I'm not saying that. But if our hearts have been transformed, as Paul says, we've been saved on 2 good works. The fruit of transformation is how you treat people, how you care for people. Even people you may disagree, even your enemies, because Jesus says, love your enemies. And we have to even be mindful of the very people we don't care for, that God expects us to treat people in a way that he cares for them. And who knows, maybe by trusting God, they can come into relationship with Christ. And so maybe we need to be careful in how we treat people. And the last one, a mischaracterization of Jesus, a mischaracterization of Jesus. And I think this is a big one, because even when Jesus goes in on these religious leaders, I mean, he really kind of just lays into them. There's a sense that in spite of that, he still has incredible compassion for the people. And so here I want to give you verse 37, where he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And again, Jesus is probably crucified between 33 and 36. That's where most historians and scholars place the crucifixion and resurrection. And we do know that Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed about AD 70. So here he's being prophetic. He's coming in the spirit of the Old Testament prophets, and he predicts the destruction of Jerusalem. But he does it with compassion. He does it with brokenness. And here there's a mischaracterization of him. He was called, a leader that led people astray. He was called a demon. I mean, So many things he was mischaracterized as, even when the charges were, when he was brought before Pontius Pilate and the charges that were trumped up against him, that he was constantly mischaracterized. And here, the religious leaders are guilty of doing something that we definitely see something that Nicodemus didn't do. And Nicodemus, who was also a leader, he doesn't judge Jesus until he sits down privately and has a conversation with him. He investigates him. He wants to know for himself. He knows he's got a following. He knows he's performed miracles. This is John chapter 3. But he wants to know for himself. He's not listening or to third-hand information. He's not going by the pundits. He's not going by what somebody told him. No, he's finding out for himself. And here Jesus, I think, is making that sense of condemnation here. And he's really kind of broken over it, if you will, is because they really didn't try to find out if he truly was the Messiah. And boy, isn't that appropriate for our times? That people think they know who Jesus is, but they really have not taken the time to discover exactly what he taught, what he was about, and what his mission was in the world. Who is he? And I think that's one of the indictments of the culture. And I would go so far to say that's an indictment even against Christians, that we don't really know the Savior that we have. And here I even put myself in that boat, that I'm always trying to learn more about this Jesus that came to this earth and did so much in terms of living the example and then dying in my place, that I might live for him and one day be in his presence. And so that's what I wanted to leave you with here. I'm not suggesting that God operates out of his boundaries of this final judgment, but I think it's a fair statement to say these passages like Matthew 23 and many others are really stern warnings to Christians that we really need to be careful about how we treat people, about what we say, what we stand on is dogmatic. As one of my friends would say, theology has consequences. And I don't have a problem with someone living with the consequences, but you better make sure it's the right consequences that you're willing to live with. And I will always be willing to live with the right consequences and not the consequences that actually dishonor God. God bless you. I think I'm back. We're back in the saddle. I definitely thank you for your prayers and support during this time. And I definitely will see you in the next video. Take care.